I'm really delighted to be here to host this event. My name is Ragui Assaad. I'm a visiting professor at the economics department at AUC this year, but I'm also a member of the advisory board of Alternative Policy Solutions, which is one of the organizations co-hosting this event. And I am also a research fellow at the Economic Research Forum, which is the other organization co-hosting this event. And I'll talk about both of these organizations a little bit more in a minute. My day job, however, is professor of public affairs at the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota in the US. So today's event, Equalizing Opportunity, with Professor John Roemer from Yale University, comes as part of the Alternative Policy Solutions effort to bridge the gap between academic knowledge and applied practice by bringing together world-renowned experts, national talent, and practicing professionals. And for this talk, Alternative Policy Solutions is partnering with ERF, the Economic Research Forum, as I mentioned. Let me say a few things about APS, or Alternative Policy Solutions. It is a public policy research project housed here at AUC. The project's mission is to provide innovative and forward-looking policy proposals in areas of economic development, management of natural resources, and institutional reform from a standpoint of inclusive development. The project employs a participatory approach through broad consultation with policymakers and various concerned stakeholders to draft policy solutions in support of the pursuit of inclusive development policies by Egyptian policymakers. Alternative Policy Solutions is one of a number of research project units housed at AUC. Some of them have been around for a long time and have enriched the public domain in Egypt for quite a long time. Some of these include the Desert Development Center, which works in partnership with the Egyptian government in the field of sustainable environment. Now, the current incarnation of the Desert Development Center is called the Research Institute for Sustainable Environment. Another one which you may be familiar of is the Social Research Center, which partners with a number of government agencies on demographic and social research. So we hope that Alternative Policy Solutions will become as long-lived and as influential as these previous research project centers, research centers at AUC. Let me say something about ERF, the Economic Research Forum. So ERF is a regional network dedicated to promoting high-quality economic research and to contributing to sustainable development in the Arab countries, Iran and Turkey. ERF is an international NGO or regional NGO that is headquartered here in Egypt. It was established in 1993 with the core objectives to build strong research capacity in the ERF region, particularly in the field of economics and applied economics, to lead and support the production of independent, high-quality economic research, and to disseminate research output to a wide and diverse audience. And I think both organizations are really delighted to be able to host Professor John Roemer. So let me say a few words about Professor Roemer. Professor Roemer is the Elizabeth and Varick Stout Professor of Political Science and Economics at Yale University. His work concerns the intersection of political economy, political philosophy, and economic theory. His current interests include the construction of the micro foundations for human cooperation, essentially an economic theory of cooperation, a topic that was ignored for a long time by economic theory, which focuses, as you know, on competition rather than cooperation. And this was the topic of his lecture 2 days ago at the Tagammu campus of AUC. So he is also a fellow of the Econometric Society, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a corresponding fellow of the British Academy. and a past fellow of the Russell Sage Foundation and the Guggenheim Foundation. He holds honorary doctorate degrees from the University of Athens and the Queen Mary University in London, and his actual PhD is from the University of California in Berkeley, and he's also the past president of the Society for Social Choice and Welfare. Dr. Roemer has a long list of very influential and heavily cited books. They include A General Theory of Exploitation and Class, published in 1982, Theories of Distributive Justice, published in 1996, Political Competition, published in 2001, Racism, Xenophobia, and Distribution, published in 2007, Sustainability for a Warming Planet, published in 2015, and a book that he's currently in press on How We Cooperate, a Kantian Explanation, which will be published this year. And then he has the book that relates most directly to the topic of today's talk. It's called Equality of Opportunity, published in 1998, which has been extremely influential. In fact, he is often referred to as the father of the field because of this book. And so we're extremely lucky to have him with us to talk about his notion of equality of opportunity, how we measure it, how we understand it, how it's different from simple questions of equality. And this is going to be the topic of today's event. So let me start by asking you, John, if you could just spend a little bit of time telling us about your approach to equalizing opportunity or to equality of opportunity as a way of achieving social justice, and how it differs from other approaches to address inequality and distributive issues.
I'd love to if I can turn on the mic. I think I have. Okay, I need the clicker for the slides. Okay, equality of opportunity as a policy or a set of policies attempts to level the playing field so that individuals who have access to the same income will have access to the same incomes if they work diligently. So what causes an uneven playing field for these economic competitors, people in the job market, let's say, competing for jobs and incomes? It's what causes the unequal playing field, the troughs and the mounds in the playing field, are circumstances beyond the control of individuals which affect how well they're going to be able to compete for jobs. Principally, resources available to them during their youth. Incomes individuals receive are due to, on the one hand, these circumstances which are beyond their control, and secondly, to the voluntary decisions they make, such as the decision about how hard to work. Circumstances consist of conditions largely determined by the family into which one is born. The resources the family has, the level of education of the parents, whether the child can even go to school rather than being forced to go to work at a young age, and so on. So these are circumstances that obviously impact tremendously on what the income prospects of the individual will be. And the second factor are the choices and the effort that the individual chooses to make. Equality of opportunity is said to hold when incomes depend only on effort. That is to say, the effects of circumstances have been sterilized through policy, explicitly through education and other policies. Now, equal opportunity is an ideal. The ideal is that how well a person does in life, and in particular the income that he or she earns, should depend only on her effort and choices, not upon circumstances beyond her control. That's the ideal. Why is that an ideal worth pursuing? Because one's circumstances are a matter of luck. They're things you didn't have the option to choose, like the family into which you're born. And outcomes people enjoy should not depend upon luck, but upon voluntary choices and effort. This is the foundational ethical principle. The most important of these circumstances are associated with the family, as I said, in which the child is raised, because the family makes available all kinds of resources, or makes unavailable resources that are necessary for the child to develop into a productive adult. The education that the child receives is paramount, but the education a child receives is in most countries largely determined by the resources available to the family. I mean, even if we have public education, state schools, the quality of the schools that children attend is very, very often closely associated with the income of the parents. And of course, in many countries, children, you have to pay something even for K through 12 education. It may be possible, or it may be impossible, to realize full equality of opportunity to reach this ideal, but it's an ideal that I'd say is worth aiming for. And I believe it's important to have a clear goal that follows from an ethical point of view, even if the goal is not realizable immediately. So I'm going to introduce one mathematical concept in this talk, and some of you will know what it is, but I just want to explain it for everybody, or remind you what it is in case you've seen it and forgotten. It's the idea of a cumulative income distribution function. So on the horizontal axis here, we have the income of, let's say, the individual. I don't know what the units are. I've just written down 20, 40, 60, and 80. And on the vertical axis, we have percentage, going from 0 to 100%. So what the graph tells us, which is the CDF, or the cumulative distribution function, is the fraction of income in a society is the fraction of people who have a given income or less. So let's take an example. If we look at 40, whatever it is, thousands of pounds, 40, that's approximately, I don't know, 15%, okay? So that says that 15% of the people in this economy get incomes of 40,000 or less. Everybody gets an income of 80,000 or less. This is 100% up here. And so 80 is the maximum income. Obviously, this curve has to be strictly increasing, because as you look at greater and greater incomes, assuming that the income distribution is distributed continuously over the whole interval, you're going to have more people involved, right? So that's the cumulative distribution function. You could just call it the income distribution. This is the best mathematical way of summarizing the income distribution of the country. So what's the median income, for instance? The median income, I haven't put on here. I was stupid not to write it, but it would be the income associated with 50% of the population having that income or less. So the median would be something like 38,000, okay? Can you read off the mean income in this society, the average income? Well, you can actually compute it from this curve, but you can't read it off easily. The way you compute it, I'll just tell you, it turns out that the average income in the society is the area of this part here. It's the area above the graph and below this line at 100%. But I'm not going to explain to you why that's true. That's a little bit more advanced statistics. So this tells you everything that you would want to know about the income distribution. You can do everything with this curve. Now, what is it? I'm going to give you an example of inequality of opportunity that's quite dramatic. I'm going to take as, of course, I don't know all the circumstances beyond the control of individuals which affect their incomes, but I'm just going to take one circumstance that's very important, and that's the education of the parents. It turns out that the income of the child, when he becomes a worker, is very closely correlated with the degree of education. In fact, it's not just the parents, specifically it's the education of the mother. because the mother is the one who has the biggest impact on the intellectual development of the child. So this I'm giving you, it's Ecuador. These are data that I worked with in Ecuador. And the reason I give you the Ecuador example is it's a very nice picture of inequality of opportunity. So there are 7 cumulative distributions of income shown here for 7 types of male workers. What are the types? The 7 types are defined by the level of education of the parents of the worker. So people in this type out here with this income distribution had parents, both of whom were illiterate. People in this type had parents, one of whom was illiterate, but the other of whom had a basic education, and so on. In other words, I'm increasing the educational level of the parents, and as I move down, until we get to this group here, the income distribution of this group, these are the men whose parents had university educations. Okay, now what we see is that the worst income distribution is this one here, and the best income distribution is this one here. You can tell that, for instance, by looking at the median. The median income in this distribution, these are the ones, the men whose parents were illiterate, the median income is about, I don't know, 3,000 escudos, or whatever the unit is there, whereas the median income in this group is 11,000. So it's 3.5 times as much. So the farther down you go in this array of distributions, the more privileged are the children. So notice, that's only one statistic I've looked at, only one circumstance, the education of the parents. And we can see it has a massive effect on children's income. Now, that's not the only thing. Within each type, there is a whole distribution of income. It's not that the income is concentrated within each type. In this type here, even this very poor type, the incomes go from 0 up to 20,000. There's some very small fraction of people in that type who actually succeed. And what does that due to? Well, that may be due to other circumstances which we haven't described, because there are lots of other circumstances besides your parents' education, or it may be due to the fact that those people worked harder, or it may be due to the fact that they were luckier. Okay. The theory tends to ascribe what the differences that lie along the curve to effort and luck, right? And it says at least we can isolate a large part of the income inequality as due to this particular circumstance. So now I'm going to give you a very quick world tour in about 10 seconds. Here's some work I did in Uganda. We divided the set of workers up into 4 types based upon their parental education, which was either post-primary, just completed primary, some primary, or no primary, illiterate. And you see, again, a very big dispersion of the income opportunities available to the children of people as a function of the level of education of their parents. Big amount of inequality of opportunity, worse than Ecuador, in the sense that those curves are farther apart than in Ecuador. Well, here's my favorite country, Denmark. Again, 3 types here based upon the education of the parents, or the mother maybe it was in this case, but now they're very, very close together. So in Denmark, it doesn't matter an awful lot how much your parent was educated for your future income prospects, because the state, the welfare state, does a lot to compensate children from poor families and from uneducated families with extra resources. And with other things like national health service, so that people don't have to pay for their health service. So that immediately equalizes opportunities to some extent, because it means that a particular part of the family's consumption doesn't any longer have to be paid for by the family. Let me continue the world tour. Sweden, another very egalitarian country. These curves are very close together. Here's the United States, less egalitarian than these countries. The purple curves are the whites, 4 types of white workers, depending on parental education. And the blue-green curves are blacks, 4 types of blacks. And you can see that generally the white curves are all they're doing much better than the blacks, except for the black workers from the most educated families. There are very few of them, so this curve is rather sparse. But these are the children of black parents who had university educations. So they do better than some of the white types. But generally, these 3 black types do worse than every white type, even the most poorly educated white type. Okay. Here's Egypt, finally. So this is work that I did in collaboration with Ragui Assaad and some other authors, some other co-authors. And this is one of the computations we made. So here we looked at wage income. We looked at parental education divided into 4 groups, lower, middle, and upper. And again, we see the same pattern. This group here are the children. I think this is males. Male wage earners, 30 to 49. So this is the income distribution of the children of parents who were in the most highly privileged educational group, upper education. It didn't mean, I think, that they both had university educations, but they both had at least some tertiary education, the parents. And this light gray line is the worst off educational parent group, where the parents had no education. And again, we see if we look at the median income of this worst off, most disadvantaged group is about, I don't know, 220 or something. What is the unit here?
International dollars.
Per annum?
Yeah, PPP dollars.
So this is
per month.
This is PPP dollars per year or per month?
Per month.
Per month. So that's 220, whereas the median for this group is about twice as much. So there's a substantial amount of inequality of opportunity. We notice here in Egypt, and we'll see this again, that the 3 more disadvantaged groups are fairly close together, right? And then there's a real jump when we get to the children of parents who have university educations. And probably you understand that from your society. Here's another circumstance. So here we're not looking at the education of the parents, but we're looking at the wealth of the household into which the child was born, the accumulated assets that the household has. And again, we see the same sort of pattern. This time there are 5 groups going from poorest, least wealth, probably close to 0, up to the richest group. And again, we see the same thing, that the richest group really does substantially better. This is remember, what is this? This is the income of the children of the richest group, right? So the median income for the poorest group is $200 per annum, per month, and the income of the richest is about twice as much. Remember, this is the children of people who are the richest, not the richest themselves. Here is a dynamic picture of Egypt. The years go 1988, 98, 2006, 2012. So let's just compare the oldest, the 1988 picture, to the 2012 picture. And we do notice some really significant improvement in inequality of opportunity. Namely, here, all 4 of these types, these are the types defined by parental income, are really quite far apart. Whereas here, there has been convergence in the 3 more disadvantaged types. It's still true that the most advantaged type does substantially better than the other 3. But there does seem to be some equalization, which occurred, we don't see it yet in '98, but we see it in 2006. So that deserves further discussion and a thought as to why that happened, what happened during that period that caused that improvement. Now, we can ask the question, what fraction of inequality comes from circumstances, different circumstances that people face, and what fraction of it comes from differential effort? In other words, what fraction is due to the fact that people are in different types with respect to circumstances, and what fraction is due to the fact there's a great deal of variation within each type? That would be due to differential effort as far as we can see, or it may be due to other circumstances we haven't measured. Now, it turns out that in advanced countries like the United States, only about 20% of income inequality is due to the circumstances, the obvious circumstances you would name, namely the race of the individual, the education of the parents, and whether the person lives in a rural or an urban region. Only about 20%. That seems sort of not very much. And you might hastily conclude, therefore, that 80% of inequality is okay, ethically speaking, because it's due to luck and effort. Luck you can't do much about, and effort is a legitimate cause of differences in income, according to this viewpoint. In Egypt, only about 10% of wage inequality is explained by the education of one's parents. So you might have thought that those graphs I just showed you would imply that a lot more than 10% was due to the circumstances, but it turns out that most of the inequality, if you design a statistical measure which enables you to calculate that, is due to the inequality that occurs within each type and not between them. Even including other circumstances, the region of the country and parental occupation in Egypt only boosts the role of circumstances to about 15%. Now, it's very important my talk doesn't end here, because it's the wrong conclusion. Why? It turns out that too many circumstances are missed by looking only at parental education, occupation, and region. If we look at the United States, we find that if other circumstances are included on which we have data, circumstances which mainly have to do with the attributes of the child as he or she was growing up, and measurements of how many resources the child received through parental attention in the household and so on, then almost 50% of income inequality in the United States is due to circumstances. As I said, these other circumstances have to do with the care of the individual as a child, the resources devoted to nurturing the child, to enriching his or her life through quality education, through parental attention, and so on. Now, these resources are all scarce for poor families, and they're abundant for rich families. My conjecture is, since Egypt is a far less developed country than the United States, that well over half of the inequality in Egypt is due to inequality of opportunity. That is to say, it's due to circumstances beyond the control of people which massively affect what their income prospects are during their working lives. However, we don't at present have the data to measure this in Egypt. We only have the data to make this kind of calculation, this thick description of the way, how the child was raised and what kind of environment the child had. We only have that data for a very small number of rich countries. We don't even have it for all European countries. The best data are from the United States and Britain at present. So one call I would make is that it's really necessary to get an understanding of how unethical the inequality is that exists in countries. It's really important to be collecting these kinds of data in all countries, including developing countries. Early childhood education is especially important. There are many non-market institutions that are required to engender justice. For instance, public education. The new frontier here is large investments in early childhood education to compensate children for the disadvantages they have due to their family circumstances. Let me give an example. A child before the age of 3 from a professional family in the United States hears 11.2 million words per year. In a working class family, the child hears 6.5 million words per year. And from a family on welfare, very poor family, the child hears 3.2 million words a year. Now I ask you to think about the difference that makes in the formation of the child's language, reasoning capacity, intelligence. Almost all of these things are very closely associated with how much you hear spoken language from adults. Incidentally, plunking your child in front of the TV set does not do it. The words have to be heard, the language has to be conveyed by a human being. That's what's also been shown by the psychologists. It has to be a human being who's paying attention to the child that conveys the language. So these differences have massive effects on language formation and thinking ability. I'm going to end with 2 graphs that show another way that we have underestimated the total, the effect, the inequality of opportunity in Egypt. One graph, I guess. So this is a graph which shows income inequality in Egypt over the period 1999 to 2015. If you want to know where this comes from, it comes from something called the World Income Database that you can access on your computer. It's a website, and it's put together by the French economist Thomas Piketty and his group of researchers. Piketty, I would say, is the most important economist today working on inequality. He's the one who published the book called Capital in the 20th Century a few years ago. So here we have 2 graphs. The top graph is the fraction of income in Egypt that goes to the top 10% of the population. So it has gone from about 50% in 1999 to about 48%. So the top decile of the population captures 1/2 of the income in this country. This is the graph of what the top 1% captures. The top 1 in 100 families capture 20%, about 20% of the total income. That means the average income of people in the top 1% is about 20 times what the average income in the country is. Now, if you look at the income of the bottom 50% in Egypt, he didn't have those figures in the World Income Database, but typically the bottom 50% would get maybe 5 to 7% of the total income, right? So those people get about, if they get 5%, they're getting 1/10 of what the average income is in the country. So the ratio of the household income of these people to the household income of people on average in the bottom half is about 200 to 1. That's the ratio of 20 to 1/5. To 1/10. 20 to 1/10. The ratio is 200. Now that's a massive, massive difference, right? Now the 1% people don't really show up here. I mean, these 4 graphs are covering more than, they're not picking out the top 1%. The most privileged group is the group of individuals whose parents had some tertiary education. That's more than 1% of the population. So when you think of this smaller slice, and these are the people who probably are closest to setting state policy. These are the rich generals. These are the rich capitalists in the country who are often very closely connected to the military and the state apparatus, those people have an average income of 200 times the average income of people in the bottom half. And that's the main source of inequality of opportunity in Egypt, and it would be so in almost all countries. And it's that inequality, it's policies that will change that inequality, which are the most important ones to enact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for this really clear explanation of the concept of inequality of opportunity. So I've heard you say before that some measure of inequality of opportunity is actually a measure of development, that it's a substitute measure for things that we like GNP per capita or such measures. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that idea?
Well, if you take the standard measure of economic development, it's GNP or GDP per capita, right? That measure is based upon an ethical idea. The ethical idea is that the most just, that the best measure of how good or how well the country is performing for people is the total income of the population. And so if we want to look at how that impacts on an individual, we say, well, we divide the population by the number of people. And that gives us GDP per capita. But the question is whether that's really the best measure of how well a society is doing for its members. And I say that it's not a very good measure. I say a much better measure, it's based on another philosophical idea, namely that we should try to make it the case that how well people do in society is based upon how hard they try rather than on circumstances beyond their control. Now, this conflict has played out in political philosophy over the hundreds of years, but very sharply over the last 60 or 70 years. Up until around 1950 or 1960, the main idea in philosophy for conceptualizing how well a society was doing or how just a society was called utilitarianism. And utilitarianism maintains that what justice consists in is maximizing the total welfare of people in the population. It's adding up the welfare levels of everybody. Now, if you define welfare as a first approximation to be indicated by a person's income, that what you say is you want to maximize the income of the population. But obviously, you have to normalize that by the size of the population. We're not going to say that a country with $100 million, that a GDP of $100 million is more just than a country with 50 million if the 100 million country has 20 times as many people as the 50, rather if the 50 million country has, if the 100 million country has 20 times as many people as the 50 million country. So the measure of GDP per capita is not just a technical measure. It's not just telling us how good the technology of a country is. It's telling us it's a measure, it's corollary to utilitarianism as a philosophical theory. Now, beginning in 1970, in 1971 was the year that John Rawls, the American philosopher, published a book that you've all heard of called A Theory of Justice. And in that book, Rawls made a very protracted, careful argument that equality of incomes or equality of welfare should be the thing that constitutes justice in a society. And that began a debate in philosophy which went on for about 50 years, until about the present time. And the debate was about what was supposed to be equalized. Okay, even if we agree with Rawls's egalitarian sentiments, what should be equalized? Should it be the income they have? Should it be their welfare? Should it be the resources that they have, but not necessarily the income they earn? And the sort of equilibrium in that discussion, what that discussion eventually argued, was that what one should equalize are some kinds of resources that a person has, but not necessarily the income he earns. Why? Because the person should be responsible for converting income into resources. We want to hold people responsible for a good deal of what they do. So Rawls argued that what should be equalized are what he called primary goods, which are resources that are necessary for conducting any kind of a life, but that people should be responsible for the particular plan of life they chose, and in particular whether they chose to work hard and make money or write poetry and live very close to subsistence. So money wasn't necessarily the measure of justice, because personal choice is important. So the culmination of that discussion I've summarized by saying, and what the phrase that Rawls used, which had a big effect, was that the resources that a person has, many of the resources a person has, in particular those associated with the country in which he's born and with the family into which he's born, are due to luck, and they are what Rawls called morally arbitrary, which meant that they didn't have anything to do with the evaluation of justice. So that's basically the theory, that the way we should measure how well a society is doing is by using a measure which is closely linked to what we think the best theory of justice is. So if you agree with my claim, which is basically comes from Rawls, that we should try to inoculate people against the impact of morally arbitrary circumstances on their lives, but allow how well they do in life to be influenced by how hard they try, that gives rise to this viewpoint. So I say that the more a country, the greater equality of opportunity, the more it's developed in an economic point of view. That's my view. So for me, the most developed countries in the world are not the US and Qatar or other rich countries in the Middle East. They're the Scandinavian countries, which have gone closest to equalizing opportunities for their citizens.
But I've also heard you say that the income of the lowest type would be a good measure of development. So rather than take the average income, take the income of the lowest type. Is that something you would consider as a measure of development as well?
I think the income of the lowest type, the average income of the most disadvantaged type, is a reasonably good statistic for the extent to which it's equalized opportunities. Yeah. I mean, let's take poverty. We all agree that a high poverty rate is a measure of lack of economic development. Well, who's poor? It's largely people in the most disadvantaged type. So the extent that you have a low poverty rate means that the lowest type has quite a high average level of income. So these ideas are very similar.
Great. Well, as you have shown in your graphs on Egypt, and I want to bring the discussion back to Egypt a little bit, if you take the typical measures of inequality of opportunity, which is basically the share explained by circumstances, you would conclude that inequality of opportunity has declined significantly in Egypt since 1988, which goes really counter to what most people's perceptions are. Most people would tell you that inequality of opportunity has risen pretty dramatically. And so we come up with results based on imperfect measures that fly in the face of what people believe. But then you look into these results a little bit more, and you see that the reason these measures of inequality of opportunity have fallen is not because the richest are now closest to the poorest, it's because the middle class has collapsed, right? It's the middle group that is now collapsing towards the poor, but the richest are exactly where they are. So we have a society that maybe is less unequal, but more polarized. And people would think that the collapse of the middle class is actually a huge problem, right, for development, for all kinds of issues. So could you elaborate on that a little bit in terms of what you think of these results that we found for Egypt?
Well, you know, you're the expert on Egypt. I'm not. In fact, I didn't even understand when I gave the talk that was the reason that those three top graphs had gotten closer to each other. So you're saying it actually wasn't a lessening of inequality of opportunity. It was a collapse of the middle class. So, I mean, that's just an example of how you should never give any advice to a country unless you've spent 5 years living there, right? I mean, so I made a mistake because I'm really not familiar with what's happening in Egypt. So all I would have to say is you have to learn how to understand these graphs and see what they're telling you. You know, what you say may well be true, and then one should try to develop finer ways of measuring inequality of opportunity so that you would display that fact. I mean, I would agree, in a sense, if the middle class collapses and has the same prospects as poorer classes, that's an equalization of something, but it's not a good equalization. It's not a good equalization. So actually, the way that I like to measure inequality of opportunity is by, as you said, the average income of the worst off type. I don't know exactly how that has fared in Egypt. You could probably tell me.
Well, actually, I mean, from these graphs, we can see that most of the movement that has happened is the middle types moving towards the worst, the worst not having done too badly in terms of, at least not having declined or their income so much. But part of the issue, of course, is we're not measuring income here, we're measuring consumption or wages.
Right.
And those don't include a huge amount of non-wage income that the rich are obtaining. And so we're probably understating the amount of inequality among the rich in particular, because a great deal of the income of the rich is in non-wage income forms. And so I think there are lots of things that are missing from these data. And I'm actually curious where Piketty is getting his data, because there is a very large debate over missing top incomes in Egypt.
Right. I'm curious also because typically Piketty's way of accumulating these figures on inequality in countries is to use tax data. And that was a kind of a revolutionary approach because prior to that, people had mainly used survey data. Surveys, of course, are limited to relatively small numbers of people. And also, the rich often say they're not going to participate. Participation in surveys is voluntary. So very, very rich people refuse to participate in these surveys. Whereas the tax data, you can catch the incomes of the very rich, or at least the part that they report for taxation. There's always a problem of underreporting. But in Egypt, you have the rich don't pay much taxes.
And we don't release tax data.
And you don't collect those data. So I don't know how they estimate it. But if you go to that world income data set, they give footnotes about the procedures they used for each country.
It's almost certainly consumption survey data.
Maybe it is, yeah. And they don't have wealth data for Egypt. The difference between wealth and income, wealth is a stock. It's the total value of the assets that you own minus your debts. Whereas income is a flow. It's something you get each year. And one of the problems with wealth is actually very, very important, maybe more important than income, because it gives you security, right? If you have if you have $1 million in the bank, it's not so important if you're unemployed for a year or so. You can live off the wealth. So wealth data and wealth really are very probably more closely associated with political power than income. And most countries in the world do not have very good wealth data because wealth is not taxed. There are examples of wealth taxes. Property is usually taxed in most countries, real estate. But financial wealth is usually not taxed. That is to say, the stocks and bonds that you own, the value of the total equity you own, and those are the big forms of wealth in a capitalist country. So Piketty has proposed in his book to establish wealth taxes in every country. They don't have to be big to begin with, because the purpose to begin with is simply to be able to have a good census of what the distribution of wealth is in a country. People have to pay wealth taxes, then they have to report their wealth. I mean, assuming you can keep them from hiding it, they have to report their wealth. And it would be very important for us to understand the distribution of power in countries, to have a good understanding of what the distribution of wealth was in countries. Now, there's also a big, just as a sort of a footnote, the very, very wealthy manage to hide a good deal of their wealth. They manage to hold it in secret bank accounts, which up until the Second World War were mainly in Swiss banks. But now there are a whole bunch of places in the world that allow you to hide your wealth, the Cayman Islands and these small island nations that allow you to hold wealth without ever reporting it to anybody. And there's a collaborator and a student, a former student of Piketty, who's estimated that at least 8% of the wealth in the world is in these secret accounts. And it varies in regions. Of course, it's almost all from very rich people. I mean, you don't set up one of these accounts if you're an ordinary person. And the figure for Africa is that their estimates are that about 50% of the wealth in Africa has been stolen by the leaders of the African countries and put in secret accounts. Now, it's a fairly small fraction of world wealth, because even the African potentates aren't that wealthy, right? They're not like Bill Gates, who has a wealth of $80 billion. But half of the wealth of Africa has probably been squirreled away, stolen by the leadership, and put in secret bank accounts. I don't know what the figure, I don't remember if he had a figure for the Middle East. But there's a book about this by a guy named Zuckman, if you want to look for it. I might remember the title in a few minutes.
So actually, this maybe gives me the opportunity to advertise one of the policy solutions that Alternative Policy Solutions is putting forward, which is a wealth tax. Am I correct? So that's something for Egypt, a sort of wealth tax. In fact, there is now a relatively new real estate tax that was introduced in Egypt. It's still in its early phases of application, but that's kind of one form of wealth taxation that is being introduced.
Right.
Now, let me ask you one final question before we open it up for audience questions. Now, you've spoken about some measures that some states, like the Scandinavian states, have taken to equalize opportunities. But if you could say a little bit more on what some of these policy measures ideally would be, besides early childhood education that you did mention, because I think we are, after all, looking for alternative policy solutions.
Of course, it's very important to do that, but it seems to me it's going to be very difficult to do it without having a real democratic political system, because these measures are won by people fighting for them, and they fight for them largely through the ballot box. In Sweden and Denmark and Norway, about 50% of total GDP is collected through taxation. Not just income taxation, but value-added taxes, about 50%. And that, so think of what would happen if you had 50% of your income collected in taxes and then used for goods and services for the people as a whole. You collect currently, I've been told, about 13% of your GDP in taxes. And that's basically because you don't tax the rich. And the reason you don't is because they control the state and they don't want to be taxed. And Tahrir Square was not a big enough movement to force them to pay taxes. That's basically the story. There wasn't a democratic movement, social movement, to continue what Tahrir Square started and to end up with some legislation. So what do they do with these taxes in these Nordic countries? Well, first of all, they have universal health care, paid for entirely by taxes. Everybody gets health care. They have a very good educational system. Nobody pays for any education, even at the university level. So I understand that the annual tuition at American University in Cairo is $20,000. That's a huge amount for an Egyptian to pay. Obviously, only the very wealthy can do that.
Yeah, but thank God, very small fraction of people go to AUC.
Okay, right.
Most people go for it.
Yeah, but it is probably the best university, right?
Well, but most public universities are completely free.
Okay.
And that itself, I've argued, results in inequality of opportunity, not equality.
Okay. So anyway, what happens in Scandinavia is they don't have open admissions to universities. There is a, you know, the places are restricted. I don't know what fraction goes to university, maybe 25, 30%. But if you go, everything is paid for, your room and board and your tuition. So that's done. There is also a policy called the solidaristic wage policy. So that means basically a high minimum wage, a very high minimum wage. Now, the reason the high minimum wage was adopted, it's interesting, there were negotiations in Sweden and Denmark and Norway among three groups: the labor unions, which are represented by a single national labor union federation, the state, the government, and representatives of the capitalist class, of the firm owners in the country. And since these countries are very heavily dependent upon export income, because they're very small countries, Sweden is 10 million people, Norway is 6 million people, and this happened in the 1950s. Since they're very poor countries, very small countries, it's very important for them to maintain a very efficient manufacturing and productive sector, because they have to be able to sell their goods internationally. So they have to be able to cut costs and, you know, sell at low prices and sell good goods, make well-engineered goods. And so what they agreed to, what actually both the firm owners and the labor unions agreed to, was to have a very high wage for unskilled workers in order to force out of business the inefficient firms. So the inefficient firms that had to pay low wages to unskilled workers to make profits could not pay this relatively high wage for the unskilled workers, and they died. And that created a much more sort of lean and mean productive sector. The wages of the highly skilled workers were not increased that much. So what that did was narrow the wage differentials. And it's still the case now, this was in the 1950s, this policy was adopted. It's still the case now that even though the wage, what they call wage solidarity, has loosened up a good deal, it's still the case that the ratio of skilled labor to labor earnings is much smaller in these countries than it is in other capitalist countries. So that was another policy, the wage solidarity policy. Another thing that they've done, which I think is due to their social ethic, now they had a very strong labor union movement, which was represented by the social democratic parties in these countries, which were formed in the the late teens and the 1920s. And these countries preached an egalitarian ethic. And so these countries do have much more of an egalitarian social ethic just in everyday life. And one of the consequences of that egalitarian ethic is that we have high taxes and we redistribute income to people who are not so well off. And we have very massive social insurance. So they have a very protracted welfare state. They have all firms offer maternity care. I think it's something like you get a year's worth of paid leave from your job. I think most of these countries have insisted that the leave has to be taken at least half by the father and half by the mother, so that the father has to spend time raising the child, and for gender equality. They have very strict laws about the fraction of women who are in parliament. I think at least 40% of the parliament and at least 40% of the leadership of firms have to be women. I told you the maternity leave, the vacation leave is also very high. The average number of hours worked per year in, I don't know Scandinavia, but in Germany, in Northern Europe, is 1,200 hours per year. That's the average worker. And German workers, as you know, are very well off. They work very efficiently and they get paid relatively high wages. So they work 1,200 hours a year. That's, if you divide that by 50 weeks, that amortizes to 28 hours a week. 28 hours a week. In the United States, workers are working on average 35, 36 hours a week. So German workers get about 2 months of paid vacation, and they're working much less. When they work hard, but they work much less. Again, these things were won by the trade union movement, but also it was being able to translate those victories into law because of the link between the trade union movement and the social democratic parties. So part of the social ethos, I don't know, how many of you have been to a Scandinavian country? One person? A few people, okay. So I always love it when I go there. One thing that shocked me when I first went to Denmark is that when young mothers go with their children to the supermarket with the pram, they leave the prams outside on the sidewalk, outside the supermarket, and they go shopping. In the United States, if you did that, you'd be arrested. You know? It just shows you it's an indication of the social solidarity, of the degree of solidarity. The transportation system, you buy one ticket in Copenhagen, and it's good for every bus and train in the country. No matter what city you go to, you just take your ticket and you use it on the bus there. So the public transportation system is wonderful. And these things are a consequence not just of the income inequality between people, but of the social ethic, which is an egalitarian ethic. I think it's impossible for people to respect everyone else in their country, every other citizen, as an equal if they have massively different incomes. So from my point of view, income inequality is the thing that I talk about all the time, but I'm really interested in it because I think it creates social solidarity, and it creates a society of people who respect each other. and are thinking in terms of social cooperation rather than constantly in terms of competition.
Well, thank you very much. This is a time where I would like to open it up to you all to ask questions. Maybe we'll take 3 questions and then let John answer and then go back for a second round if necessary. So who would like? Okay, there is one question over here. Go ahead. Go ahead. And if you could introduce yourself and just over here, front row. Say who you are and just...
Hi, good evening. My name is... Okay. My name is Lauren Clark. I am based here at AUC, a project coordinator and researcher, archival libraries. And I wanted to go back to particularly the slide that you showed concerning the United States as it related to the different racial groups. And there was something that I thought was very pertinent when you mentioned about social solidarity, income inequality, and social cooperation. And so this led, as I kind of confirmed the question I wanted to ask, was the role of the community or particular community. So when the role of the community and how the community serves to come in and supplement for whatever income inequalities are existing as a result of, various factors, race, gender, and class. And so the first thing that came to mind when I saw about Black American populations was that if we look at during the, 50s and 60s and during these times of very intense racial segregation, income inequality, there was still the thriving of Black businesses, Black neighborhoods as it relates to business, banks that were thriving. Recently, the past few years, Black American women were and these were in prominent newspapers in the States that mentioned about the fastest startup of home businesses and so forth. The reason why you begin to see these particular, the thriving that was occurring during these times is because you had the role of the Black church, fraternities and sororities, and various other entities that came in to support any disparities that were happening economically. So I guess the question I wanted to pose is relating to that slide. Did the slide take into consideration the fact that with the percentages that were showing that they were lower among white Americans or particular category of white Americans, could there be a factor in that these particular groups are removed from their communities as it relates to when they are job seeking or finding for income inequality? Could we also take that into a position as a possibility? Because so many factors and things were coming into my mind as you were going over that slide. So again, the role of the community supplementing in what the state does not provide and looking at Black America as a case.
All right, over here.
Hi, is it working? Yeah. I'm Waleed Labadi. I'm the country manager for the International Finance Corporation here in Egypt. Very interesting presentation, thank you. I think I came away with a couple of reactions and then I had a couple of questions. So one reaction was, I actually don't know that I saw the collapse of the middle class, as you characterized it, as a failure. When I started to hear what was happening in Scandinavia as kind of a prognosis for how to achieve greater inequality, at least a greater percent of the population has some relative equality, and that's or more equality. So I saw that as a good thing. I was trying to take away from the presentation what we might prescribe for Egypt, and I'm not sure I got there in terms of what we were described as possible in Scandinavia, because I get the early childhood intervention as being impactful, but then I kind of was at a loss as, well, what else do I take away from this discussion in terms of what we might offer for Egypt in terms of promoting greater equality? Thanks.
Okay, should I take one more before we ask John to answer? Okay, Dr. Shireen Shawarbi at the back.
Shireen Shawarbi, professor in Cairo University. I'm very pleased to hear from you this lecture about inequality of opportunities. I have been working on inequality, especially on Egypt, since 2005. And we had a book on inequality inside Egypt, trying to justify why we have a moderate Gini coefficient in Egypt while we had a revolution in 2011. And I think what Ragui has referred to as the perceptions of people, whether the data, the household data does not capture the richest, but it captures the richest as good as the other data sets in the world do the same thing. So there is no problem with the data, and this is my worry. When we have a deterioration in the numbers show deterioration in inequality, we say this is what numbers show. When the numbers do not show this, we say that the numbers are wrong because the data are not good enough. If the data are not good enough, they have been of the same quality since ever. So we look at the trend. We're not talking about the levels. So what's wrong with the case of Egypt? Is this just the perceptions, or it is about the way we're still measuring inequality with? And as you said, we need to refine it to improve the measures, especially when you said that the upper middle income collapsed, and this what made more apparently equalized, so equality in poverty, what we say. But we can just using the dispersion decile ratio of this specific segment, and we see whether its ratio to the richest decline or not. So we still have to work on this more, because we still have the same problem now. People think that we're more unequal while the numbers do not support this argument. The other thing, when we compare Egypt or any large population country like Egypt with the Scandinavian, apart from being Scandinavian and the best in everything, especially in happiness, but they are small countries. Can we make comparisons between small and large countries in terms of population when it comes to inequality and policy recommendations, and to follow these countries as model for us? These are some of my questions, and we'll continue this after the lecture. Thank you very much.
Okay, John, I think you've got enough questions to answer now.
On this first question about the role of community, there is a role that community plays, especially in the black community, through the churches, of taking care of people who become destitute to some extent. I don't know the figures about that, but that may have some effect on income distribution among blacks. I'm just not sure. Charity in general in the United States has extremely little effect on the income distribution, because it turns out that most charity happens within classes, not between classes. So most charity is not of the form of the rich giving to the poor. It's the rich giving to other rich and the poor giving to other poor. So rich giving to other rich is when rich people make huge donations to the universities they attended. If they attended a very expensive university like Harvard or Yale, rich people will often give a lot of money to their alma mater, and then they get their name on a building. And the poor, the redistribution is usually within churches, which again is, since the churches are largely segregated according to income, it's the poor giving to the poor. So generally speaking, charity is not a solution to this problem. What policies for Egypt? I mean, I've been here for 5 days. I can't answer that question, but I'd say two things right off that are pretty obvious. One is taxing, implementing income taxation, and and mainly that means taxing the top 10% of the population. Secondly, antitrust, making the capitalism much more competitive. There's a large fraction of this economy which is controlled by the army and by the military, and I'm sure that they do everything they can to prevent competition from other private firms. And there's probably legislation. There's probably government behavior that doesn't give licenses to other firms if they compete with some firm that's close to the state. So I would say those two things immediately would be some policies. On the last point that the professor had in the back about the fact that Egypt has 100 million people and Sweden has only 10 million, so it's not a good comparison. All right, take Japan. Japan has 120 million people. It's bigger than Egypt, but it's very egalitarian. It has massive social insurance. I'm sure they have, you know, the kinds of benefits which they've given to the people are huge. So, so then you have to find out some other reason. In fact, if you look at Japan in 1950 and Egypt in 1950, I'll bet their GDP per capita weren't so different. Do you know what they were?
No, I think they were different, but maybe if you go to 1850 would be about
1850 then. I mean, the point is that, you know, there are large countries that have succeeded, that used to be very poor and have succeeded in developing very effectively. And there are many reasons, of course, but I mean, one can look at those countries to see what the cause was. On the other question about that the professor asked that you should answer.
I should. You give me the tough one. No, I think you're right, Dr. Shireen, about the fact when the data show inequality is declining, why do we not believe it? When the data show inequality is increasing, we tend to believe it. The reality is that our data is very partial. I mean, we know for a fact that our income and consumption survey really only measure consumption and measure consumption very badly for the top 10%. And so, and we know that because the top 10%, as John said, tend to kick you out when you go and try and knock on the door to ask them about their consumption. And when they do ask about consumption, they don't ask about your second home and your third home and your fourth home on the North Shore and on the Ain Sokhna and etc. So that we have very bad measures of consumption at the top end of the distribution. It's true we do much better at the lower end, so it's actually quite effective in measuring poverty. But it's not very effective in measuring the entire distribution when a lot of the income is at the top. Okay, we saw nearly 50% of the income is in the top 10%. If you're missing a good chunk of that, you're missing a very good chunk of inequality. And we don't know over time whether the amount of underestimation is the same. So I think the fact that it's only consumption as well misses on the fact that a lot of the savings rate, the high savings rates, are among the top of the distribution. So we really have very inadequate data to measure inequality properly. We have fairly good data to measure poverty, but we have the inequality data is not convincing. If you can get me wealth data or data about ownership of property and wealth, maybe I would start believing that, but we don't have that data. All right. Do we have another round of questions? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Shaima Meghed. I'm a lecturer at Cairo University. I'm very happy about this lecture, and I'm not an economist, but I was really touched by this topic as it's one of the major interests, but major interests from another perspective, from a political science perspective. So I would like to shed the light on some other reasons that would be on the macro level that would have some relations to unequal opportunities in different countries. Like if we look to the global south, even though these countries are not only the ones who are really suffering from inequality of opportunities, we can say that the functioning of the state itself and how the regime is maintaining the regime and the system, and how the design of policies that are addressing the main reasons behind these inequalities is one of the major problems that needs to be addressed somehow when we're trying to look into such an important topic. Like, for example, if we don't have efficiency or efficacy in terms of designing the policies, in terms of tackling really the problems and trying to solve the problems related to infrastructure, related to education, related to health, related to any other important major issues for citizens, and trying to look at marginalized people, those who are deprived of all these sources and important resources that would enable them to have access to a better income and to better living conditions. So how would we consider that when we, from an economist perspective, when we're trying to look at these reasons or all these global image or bigger image, comprehensive, let's say, when we address inequality of opportunities? Thank you.
Could you state a short question?
Yeah. How would we integrate the macro level reasons of inequality of opportunities, like the political inefficiency or the absence of liberal political systems where we have accountability and such issues that would guarantee that we would have an efficient system that would address inequality?
Okay, I don't see any more hands up. Okay, one more over there.
حسن بدر الصحفي. أولا أشكر الدكتور راجي والدكتور رومر على هذا المحاضرة القيمة فعلا، اللي هي استفدنا منها أكتر من إن إحنا ممكن نسأل، بس في كلام طبعا موجع لازم أقوله، ألا وهو من فترة من السبعينات الثمانينات التسعينات إلى هذا اللحظة الحكومة بتاعتنا بتحاول تعمل موازنة ما بين الدخل والشراء في السوق، يعني العدالة ما بين الشراء والدخل الفرد، لكن هناك صعوبات كثيرة بتقابلها، ألا وهي الظروف الثورية التي حصلت في البلاد المجاورة، وده أدى إلى رجوع أكتر من 2 مليون عامل، وده حصل تأثير قوي جدا على الاقتصاد المصري. ده نقطة ما تكلمش فيها الدكتور. ثانيا العقار ألا وهو بعيد عن الصناعات والزراعات التي لابد أن تعمل عليها الدولة للاكتفاء الذاتي، بل بالعكس احنا بنستورد اكتر ما بنصنع، وهذا برضو عائق في الدخل المصري. وحاجات كتير طبعا الزميلة والدكتورة شيماء اتكلمت فيها باستفاضة يعني، وعاوز رد من الدكتور رومر. شكرا.
Okay, we'll take one final question back there. Okay, go ahead.
Good evening. I am Ahmed Zain. Thanks for the lecture. Actually, if our target to protect the middle class in Egypt from decreasing, but actually I am not agree with doctor in what he suggests, like put more taxes for the fortune or for stocks and bonds. So I think it's not fair, but even it's not the solution. I think the solution, if we maintain the taxes system in Egypt, especially if we know that 17% of the Egyptian GDP comes from the tax, only 17%. We can make this figure number double and more if we add the informal economy to the formal economy. If we make ascending the taxes. So this is a solution, but make more taxes for the rich people or for the stocks market, I think it's not fair, especially if I am an investor in the stocks market. Thank you.
Okay, so John, I'm going to have you answer the last few questions, and that will be the end of our session today. Go ahead.
The first question, would it be fair to summarize? Who asked it again? Would it be fair to say that this was how do you implement equality of opportunity policies in a country where there's no accountability? Yeah, in an autocracy? It's very hard. I don't know. I mean, you have to struggle for some kind of democratic representation. You know, you have to have some way of getting the people to influence what the state does. And, you know, I mean, obviously millions of people in Egypt are thinking about that now since 2011. But there has to be eventually a social movement develop and political parties that represent the interests of the people, and they have to get some influence somehow. I don't know how to do that. The second point about real estate and self-sufficiency, it seems to me that I don't know, I mean, the 2 million people coming back to Egypt is somewhat of a special situation, but the fact of lack of self-sufficiency and an economy based on real estate, this is due to what I said earlier, in large part, it seems to me, of the lack of competition in the capitalist sector. You have to have a more freely competitive capitalism. I'm not for capitalism as the end story. I'm a socialist. I eventually want socialism. But I think what you need here is to develop free entry capitalism. And I'm convinced that if that exists, then firms will form and the country will produce more and it'll start exporting more than it does, or exporting something besides oranges. But I think the problem there is the close links between the firm, the people who run firms, and the state, and the protection that they get from the state. That would be my conjecture. Can you summarize the third question?
Well, the third question was disagreeing with you about taxing the rich, and particularly the gentleman understood that you were proposing to tax the stock market rather than the rich specifically.
Well, I'm proposing to tax the stocks that people own. That's part of their wealth. It's a wealth tax, just the way we tax real property. You said there's beginnings of a property tax here. I mean, lots of countries have a property tax. In the United States, that's the only wealth that's taxed. Your real estate is taxed. Now, for most people, real estate is the only asset that they own. Middle-class people. But the very wealthy, their real estate is a very, very small fraction of what they own. Their main ownership is capital goods through ownership of firms, through equity and bonds, and those things should be taxed. That wealth should be taxed. Now, there's a fear in some countries that if you tax wealth, the wealth will just leave. It'll go to another country. People will establish residency in a place where they don't have to pay a wealth tax. Well, so it has to be international. You have to do it in the whole Middle East, or you have to do it in the whole world. I mean, another important thing that can be done, I think, is to prevent money from being hidden. There should be an international movement that gets all private wealth accounts named. Occasionally we see something, the Panama Papers, I mean, occasionally there's an expose which shows that the Queen of England has stashed $1 billion in Panama, right? And lots of other people. Occasionally that happens, but there should be an international movement to get a hold of that income and bring it back and find out where it came from. And if it came from income that was not being declared, it has to be taxed. And if you have a wealth tax, then you can tax that income too. So I think a lot of these things don't have an immediate solution tomorrow. They require international cooperation and exposing where wealth is, how much wealth there is and where it is.
Please join me in thanking John.